introducing our speaker for today. He's phenomenal, and I love him a lot because it's my dad! Give it up for Andrew Pryfogle.
That was awesome, guys. That was fantastic. Thank you. I'll move this. All right. Well, good morning. It's exciting to be here. I've been looking forward to this for some time. I'm excited about what I'm going to share with you today, and I'm curious before we start. Raise your hand if you're an adult. If you're an adult, cool. Okay. Raise your hand if you're a child. Oh, not okay. So some of you guys raise your hand on the child thing. A lot of you guys didn't. That's interesting. It's interesting because the Bible talks to us about children a lot. Talks to us a lot about adults, but there's really nothing in the Bible that talks about teenagers. Isn't that interesting? You're kind of in the in-between land, aren't you? I bring that up because I'd like to talk to you today about as if you guys are adults, if that's okay. Remember when I was in high school, I used to resent kind of being talked down to. And I think you guys are probably capable of hearing some things and of learning some things and making some decisions about it and taking action on it and doing that as an adult. It's interesting. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was probably an 8th grader, right? Right. John, the apostle, was probably a sophomore when he was called to follow Christ. I think we're okay dealing with some tough and some difficult issues, but also I want you to challenge yourself to be thinking about what you do with this. Is that okay today? Can I do that? Is that a deal? All right. I want to talk to you today about what it means to be a story changer. A story changer. And as we're stepping through this, I want you to be asking an important question of yourself. And really for me, that's, so what? So what? Why should I care? What am I going to do with this? Okay? Be thinking about that as we go through this. What is a story changer? We all have a story that we're living out in our life. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And we can see the plot lines of most stories play out early on. What's the sign of kind of a mediocre or even a bad movie? What's the sign of a bad movie? It's too predictable, maybe? Is it? You can predict with some accuracy where certain decisions and life choices and habits and disciplines will end up, can't you? Our stories, yours and mine, are on a certain trajectory or path, an arc to it. We kind of can see out in the distance and see where it's going to end up. And it'll remain on that path unless something or someone changes that story. A story changer is first someone who first realizes that perhaps in their own life that trajectory, that path, that arc that they're on may end badly. That the decisions that they've made to date, the belief system that they've lived by, the attitudes they've embraced, if they continue on that path, things will end badly unless they change their story. And ending badly may mean a lot of things for a lot of people. It may be different. It may mean a tragic ending. But worse, in my opinion, is it may mean a tragic existence of mediocrity and unfulfilled potential and of narcissism and loneliness. It may mean a life focused on nothing but me and my future and my well-being and nothing about others. Brings a person, that realization, brings a person to what I call a pivot point. A moment in time where a person stops, reevaluates, and changes directions. We see an example of a pivot point, an awesome one, in the book of Ruth. Ruth was a story changer. Let me give you a little bit of background about this story. It's pretty cool. Naomi lived in Bethlehem with her husband, Elimelech, and 2 sons. And there was a famine. They ran out of food. And so they moved to a foreign land called Moab. And once they got there, Naomi's husband died. So now she's with her 2 sons in a foreign land, and her husband has died. She then was able to marry off both of her sons, remarkably. But her 2 sons then married 2 Moabite women. And 10 years later, both of her sons got sick, and they too died. So now we have an Israelite, Jewish widow with 2 daughters in Moab, in a foreign land. And she decides to go back to Bethlehem, back to her own people. And on the road back, traveling to Bethlehem, she stops and she tells her daughters-in-law, go back to your own people. She releases them. Life will be much easier for you back in Moab with your own people and what you're used to, what you've grown up with. Don't follow me. I'm on a bad path. You don't want to hang out with me. I have a really bad run of luck. God's been cursing me, not blessing me. She felt very bitter about that. And one daughter actually decided to go back. But Ruth, at that moment in time, reaches a pivot point in her life. And we see this in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Listen to what she says. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. For where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. What a bold statement by a young woman who decides at that moment to change her story. I'm not going back to my own people. I'm instead going to go on a journey to an unknown land and trust in the God of Naomi. She made a decision to change her story. And that decision had enormous implications. She'd later meet a man named Boaz, and they would fall in love and get married, an amazing love story. Should have been one of the first chick flicks. It was a great love story. You should check it out. Ruth would later become the great-grandmother of a little shepherd boy who would kill a giant and become a king, King David. And later, from the line of David, is born the greatest story changer of all time, and that was Jesus Christ himself. Your decisions matter. They matter. They have huge implications. There's another story changer I want to tell you about. My dad was a story changer. You ever heard the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue? You ever heard that? Well, my dad's name was Marion. Not quite as bad as Sue, but not as good as Bob. You know, he may have had a girl's name, but he was a guy's guy. He was an athlete. He was strong, good-looking, smart, funny. He was such a boss. But his story as a young man was a tough one. He grew up in Compton, right in the middle of South Central LA, right in the middle of the hood. And as a young man, his father abandoned him. Left him and his brother and his mother to fend for themselves. What kind of man gives his son a girl's name and then abandons him? Not cool, huh? Not cool. He grew up with no father. And in his senior year of high school, he started to go to church because it was a requirement for him to play on the fast-pitch softball team. And he loved playing fast-pitch softball. So he began hearing the gospel of Christ as he went to church, he said, on a really regular basis. But while he was hearing that, he was still living out this same story of playing hard and partying hard at the same time, until one night his story changed. He got home late from a night out drinking with his buddies. And he came in the house, and he tripped, and he fell, and he smashed his face on a coffee table. All bloodied up. He broke one of his front teeth. Ugly. But it was that evening, sitting on his living room floor, blood streaming down his face, that he realized he needed to change his story. And that only Jesus could make the change that he needed. That night was a pivot point for my dad. That night, his plot line changed. He started on a new path, a new trajectory, a new story. 2 years later, he'd get married to my mom. And later he would go to seminary and become a pastor. And over the course of 40 years, he would pastor several churches. He was a church planter. He mentored other pastors. He was a missionary to Uganda. Through his ministry, hundreds and even thousands of people accepted Christ. And stories were changed all over the world. My dad was a story changer. My dad's pivot point mattered. That night, he changed his story, and decades later, we're still seeing the impact. Just 1 month ago today, after packing up their truck to move to a new town to pastor a new church in Chowchilla, California, a church called Life Change, he suffered a massive stroke. A blood vessel in his brain popped. And he had a massive brain hemorrhage. And at 67 years old, my dad died a month ago. You know, his sudden death has forced me to consider a lot of things. It's reminded me of what little I understand about God and what a mystery his plan can be, because there's no answers for why something like that would happen. But it also caused me to reflect on my dad's life. What marked his life? What would he be remembered for? What would it be his legacy? What will be my legacy? What will that legacy be someday? What will people say at my funeral? What will they say at your funeral? At my dad's funeral, hundreds gathered to tell stories about my dad. There was one big overriding theme of all these stories. Everyone seemed to talk about it, and that was love. My dad loved people. More than anything else, he loved others. And that's the mark that he left. He loved people. He was always more interested in hearing your story than in telling his own. He was starstruck by the common man. He was amazed by people and loved hearing what God was doing in their lives. He cared deeply for them. And he loved them, and that love changed stories. Jesus commanded us to love, and he modeled that love for us. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus describes, as a question to an answer, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. That is the greatest command. Wow, what a simple just like you. Love God and love others that agree with you or believe what you believe. Love God, but only love others that you're comfortable with. He doesn't say love God and judge others. He simply commands us to love our neighbor, and our neighbor means everyone. When asked one time of Jesus, who's our neighbor? He goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. He picks the one example in Jewish life then that people hated the most. Their arch enemy, the Samaritan, people hated Samaritans. And he says, the Samaritan is your neighbor. And he was doing that as an illustration for all of us, that everyone is our neighbor, even the people we don't like, even the people we don't agree with, even the people that live a life that maybe we feel uncomfortable with. That's our neighbor. One of my favorite examples of Jesus demonstrating his love is found in John chapter 8, verse 1 through 11. I want to paraphrase this for you. A woman is caught in the act of adultery and is immediately brought to Jesus and made to stand in front of him in the crowd that was around him. And I want you to consider for a moment, what does this woman look like? What does this woman look like? She's just been caught in the act of adultery. In the act of adultery. So, best case scenario, she's been handled roughly, she's probably been beaten, she's probably bloodied, she's probably dirty, her clothes are probably torn. Best case, probably more likely, she might not have been clothed at all. And the Jewish leaders at the time bring this woman, and they bring her to Jesus, and they stand her right in front of a large crowd of people and say, Jesus, this woman here was caught in the act of adultery. What are you going to do about it? And Jesus had a very interesting and curious and random and almost ridiculous response. Do you know what he does? Picture the scene again. Jesus is teaching people, and the Pharisees come with this half-naked, beaten-up woman and says she's been caught in adultery, and they stand her right there in front of the crowd. And Jesus responds by this. He walks over and he leans down on the ground, and he starts to draw with his finger in the dirt. Does that sound bizarre to anybody else besides me? Why would Jesus do that? Why would he draw in the dirt? If you imagine being present at that morning, that day that happened, and you've seen this woman, your eyes are drawn to this woman, and this woman is obviously must be filled with shame and embarrassment. This must be one of the worst days of her life. And Jesus does something really curious, and as he draws in the dirt, what happens with the eyes of the crowd? They start looking at him instead of her. And in that simple random act, he takes her shame upon him. That's the kind of Jesus we follow. That's a powerful thing to think about, isn't it? The teachers, they yell, Jesus, you didn't answer our question. Hey, what about our question? The law says if you're caught in adultery, she should be stoned. That we should stone her to death. What do you say? Jesus draws in the dirt again. And they pester him. What are you doing? And he finally looks up and says, what? You who are without sin, cast actually changing stories? Are you willing to commit to being a story changer? Are you willing to say, today will be my pivot point? Today, September 29th, 2011, that is when I become a story changer. The story I was living, I'm changing, and I will never be the same. And today I will commit myself to loving God and loving others. I want my life to be about story change. Today, I become a story changer. What do you do with that? If you're willing to make that kind of a commitment today, very simple. We're not going to have an altar call, but I want to challenge you to do something. If you're willing to make that kind of a commitment today, I want you to do something very simple. In front of your friends and your teachers and everyone around you, I simply want you to stand. And in that simple act, make that commitment that you're going to be a story changer. Who would do that? Who would do that today? I commend you guys. That's a bold move, brave move, and it's a life-changing move. And I can't wait to see what happens in your lives as God begins to take that commitment and turn it into something that is amazing. I believe that. I believe that for each of you. Let's pray. Let's pray. Father, you are an amazing God. Interested in every one of our stories, in every one of our lives. And I pray right now, especially for those that stood today, that you, by your Spirit, will equip them and empower them with the courage they need to step out and be story changers in their school, in their families, wherever they go. Empower them by your Spirit to be story changers.